I could only say that our thinking about First Nations and their role in our society has gone light years in the period of time since I first met Kim. So we're all looking forward to hearing what Kim has to say. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good afternoon, everybody. And yeah, sorry about the kind of communication glitch that will have me dashing for the door and speaking really fast for the next 25 minutes or so. But I'd really like to thank the organizers for having me. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, my Coast Salish neighbors. And my ancestral name is Quintiltanat, named after a hereditary chief in Tawasin, my great-great-grandfather, whose name was Quintilam. Tawasin is a Coast Salish and Hunkaminam speaking community, and the traditional way of saying Tawasin is Tawathin, none of the Sawasin or Tawasin business that the debate rages on. And it roughly translates to land facing the sea. We're at the mouth of the Fraser River on the southwest coast, and we are about 35 kilometers, maybe 35 and a half south from here in the suburbs. But Coast Salish more broadly encompass a larger area that includes both the U.S. and and Canada, Vancouver Island, and up the Fraser River. And we've been in this place for many millennia before Europeans came to this continent. I currently make my living as a consultant, advising on Indigenous issues to First Nations, industry, and government. Luckily, my expertise is sought after because of the long career I had in my own community. I started working on our treaty at the age of 20, got elected on our council at the age of 22, and became the elected chief at the age of 28, where I then had the privilege to lead our community through the treaty negotiations and the implementation of our treaty. I was chief of 13 years before I got defeated by our current chief, a very humbling experience, I might add. So I often introduce myself as a recovering politician. Although I'm no longer a politician, I'm very much a policy wonk. I am very passionate about Indigenous self-determination and governance and keep current on those sorts of issues, especially as they apply in Canada. So here are some of the current images from my community of what the treaty has enabled from an economic perspective. I think our community is thriving, although the change is a challenge for us. These images are a result of rethinking our future in my community. Indeed, much of what we have done and are doing remains controversial because of the changes we are making, and they are challenging people's notions of who we are, what we're capable of, and how our self-determination is unfolding. Sadly, this is a more common outlook of what we think when we think of reserves. If you think of any statistic, First Nation people will be at the worst end of it, whether it's income level, health, overrepresentation in the child welfare system or the justice system, poor housing, education levels, high addiction rates. And this isn't just in remote reserves. In fact, people who move to the cities still fare far worse than most Canadians. Tawasin's socioeconomic conditions weren't that much better than rural and remote reserves in spite of our geography, and this kind of poverty is unsustainable to all Canadians, although First Nations feel the brunt of it. We must challenge ourselves to understand the root of these conditions, and it's not a comfy place. To get where we are today, we had to do some of our own rethinking. I call it our internal reconciliation at Tawasin. And reconciliation is a timely topic, so I'm going to discuss our need to rethink our region with that lens. But talk about messy. To understand where we are and where we'd like to go, we need to understand why we First Nations are in the situation we are in Canada, BC, and indeed here in the Lower Mainland. To me, the topic or concept of reconciliation goes beyond the residential school experiences that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has shone a light on. The foundation of this country was based on the creation of systemic structures used to ignore and erase the rights of Indigenous peoples, and this has left Indigenous communities compromised in every way imaginable. This has left us with a wellness gap, economic gap, political, social, and cultural gap. It's left First Nations with inferior governance structures and jurisdiction tools. It's left us with unsustainable communities with inadequate lands and resources and no real effective way to govern our people, lands, and resources. And it's left us without autonomy. It has left First Nations with the Indian Act and Indian reserves. Indeed, government has neglected to work on reconciling Aboriginal rights and title with First Nations since the formation of Canada and BC. So that's a lot to reconcile. And for some, these are hard truths, and this is a very uncomfortable discussion. But I think we need to have it in order to find a way forward within this country, to have that dialogue and to foster understanding, to find a way forward. In fact, one of the main recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report has to do with education and economic sustainability of Indigenous people. So while I have you all hostage here, I'm going to run through some of this for a few moments. I'll quickly go through some of the foundational history stuff. And if you think about the history of European settlement of Canada, early relations were different from region to region, but mostly conciliatory because of the balance of power was in Indigenous hands. This changed as Europeans created legal political regimes to control lands, waters, and resources in Canada and to ensure wealth from these flowed to the newcomers. Of course, we know colonization happened across the world for similar reasons. In Canada, many tools were created to govern Indigenous peoples, including incorrectly labeling them as Indians and creating many institutions to control Indigenous people, including the Indian Act, residential schools, and other measures to exclude Indigenous people from mainstream institutions. First Nations weren't able to vote until 1960, and First Nations weren't allowed to hire a lawyer for land claims, are just some of the examples of the prohibitions. This was a system of segregation. Sadly, South Africa based their apartheid model on the Indian Reserve approach in North America. And so this has left First Nations with unsustainable and in some cases unviable communities. And First Nations have been left in this situation for over a century and a half, depending on where you're talking about, but certainly the case in British Columbia. On top of this, there is a massive lack of understanding by the public about these serious and systemic issues because we never learned or talked about them until recently. And, Canada is a huge place with a huge landmass, and there's over 640 First Nations across it with vastly different geographies, cultures, and languages. And through this period of colonization, First Nations fought every step of the way. In Canada, the public is now just confronting this terrible past, and some people are greatly disturbed to find out about this history because it is disturbing. Litigation, direct action, and negotiations have all been deployed by First Nations to try and make change, but most Canadians until recently have been oblivious to this. And in the past 80 years, I'd say governments and First Nations have been wrestling with how to fix this mess. There are some efforts advanced and quite a few more underway. I could talk for hours about that topic alone, some of the initiatives underway by the current federal and provincial government, but that's not why I'm here. So coming from that historical perspective and now focusing into this region, this is a photo I took on a float plane, and it shows how gorgeous Tsawwassen traditional territory is. But it's interesting, many people would have different associations when they see this photo. Many would see great farmland when they look at this photo. Our connection to our territory is different, though, from a worldview perspective. Our survival and existence, and indeed our identity, are based on being on our lands and waters. We have many legends, but my favorite is about a mythical man named Gales, a transformer who went around our territory transforming people into animals and objects, and these stories were meant to teach. One of my favorite ones is when he came to Tsawwassen back when it was an island, and it was attached to the mainland with cedar rope. He went to the ocean's edge, and a giant octopus took hold of him, and an epic battle ensued. Hales ripped it into 5 pieces and threw them all across Coast Salish territory. Today, those are areas where you find octopi, but there's none in Tsawwassen. And our chief at the time said, "Excuse me, you didn't leave any for us." And Hales was embarrassed and turned him into a stone. But then he felt badly and said to my people, "I'm sorry I didn't leave you any octopus, but when the next great flood happens, Tsawwassen will no longer be an island and will join the mainland." And the geological record shows how over centuries our little island joined the mainland through the development of the Fraser River Delta. So I am biased, but I believe my ancestors chose our place well, because we were able to sustain ourselves for thousands of years in a relatively small territory. We had advanced arrangements in relation to resource rights, and our marriages were strategic to ensure families had enough resources to sustain themselves. But newcomers keyed into the strategic advantages of our territory. So consequently, we are now in a highly developed region with shrinking land available for our needs, including lands for industry, housing, and agriculture. When we rethink the region, I think we should embrace this history and the legends of other Lower Mainland First Nations. This map is pretty informative for what was happening with colonial settlement of our area. When our reserve was set aside in the late 1800s, our families were encouraged to get into farming, but my ancestors couldn't borrow money to get the tools they needed to succeed like their neighbors could. A consequence of this encouraged land use was that our reserve was divided amongst families, leaving very little land for those excluded, who have primarily been women over the past century. We're still grappling with these inequities as a community. So after having been excluded from the economy for well over a century, we tried to get into land development, but faced resistance from our neighboring municipality and could not access water or sewer for economic development purposes. The municipality and the public didn't think twice about making decisions over our land use, and land use is still controversial. The application of the Agricultural Land Reserve is an example. We had a hard negotiation through our treaty negotiation whether it would apply to treaty lands, the ALR, and we agreed to let it apply to half of our lands. But this was and still is controversial, and the NDP caucus was actually split over whether they would support our treaty or not in the legislature over this single issue. Like other First Nations, Tsawwassen spent a lot of effort trying to advance our rights, especially as more and more urban development eradicated our way of life. The ferry and port are at our front door, and they have drastically altered our environment. During the 80s and 90s, as the Canadian Constitution was repatriated and entrenched Aboriginal rights, our rights were evolving through case law developments, such as the landmark Sparrow decision, and through our asserted efforts. We built a condominium in the 90s known as Satsu Shores, and the challenges we faced to build a condo, and you see these everywhere, condos, they're not really that remarkable, but the resistance we faced was shocking. And a lot of it had to do with the systematic exclusion from the region. Since 1989, we attempted to acquire water and sewer from Delta, our now neighboring municipality, to pursue economic development activities, but to no avail. They had a low growth strategy, which conflicted with my community's desire to build an economy. And at the height of our conflict, we had pre-sold 75% of our first phase of Satsu, 86 units. And this is the photo of the project. And discussions on water servicing collapsed. And we had a legal commitment to our prospective buyers and felt strongly that it was our jurisdiction and we couldn't let another municipality dictate it. So we even had the pipes available, but no legal authority to turn on. We spent a lot of money paying for that infrastructure. So we ended up having to construct a very expensive reverse osmosis treatment plant and tertiary treatment sewer plant to service these condominiums. We then faced challenges from DFO related to the site we had chosen for the plant. The argument was that we were on red zone fish habitat. So we faced criminal charges where they raided our offices, our bank offices, for building the sewer plant. Leading up to the court case, INAC had also created a brand new permitting process for the sewer plant on reserve, which they had abandoned. And this had left our former plant in jurisdictional limbo for a long time. So we used the treaty to fix these situations by clarifying our legal jurisdiction. During our failed attempts to secure water from Delta prior to the construction of our plant, we had approached the Greater Vancouver Regional District, now Metro Vancouver, to provide us with water. But after several months of review, they determined that their legislation did not permit them to provide us with water service either. So we were stuck. I can't recall how many federal and provincial ministers I had spoken with to try and intervene in the situation. Aside from some mediation attempts, no one would intervene on Tsawwassen behalf. So it was during the height of these sorts of conflicts, as we were asserting our rights as a community, that we entered into treaty negotiations. And the continual external interference I faced while I was leader really changed my views from thinking that we needed a land claim for economic reasons to understanding that what we really needed was autonomy through self-governance. And, the continued external interference for us to do basic things is still really unfathomable to me. So here are some of the main elements of the treaty, but I think we have to remember that the treaty wasn't the final end goal. Rather, it's a toolbox to help us rebuild our community. And when it came to the resolution of our treaty, we knew we needed to address the lack of jurisdictional certainty I have spoken about. Being part of a large and active region with lots of pressures on resources, there is some question as to how our land use planning processes might be integrated into the broader regional land use strategy. Traditionally, First Nations have been basically whitewashed in Metro Vancouver's regional growth strategies. For example, if you look at the last livable region strategy before Tsawwassen was added, our former reserve is noted as green space. Under the treaty, we had half our new lands removed from the agricultural land reserve, and this did not comply with the regional livable region strategy either. Yet before we developed a solution, there was no answer to the protracted challenges facing First Nations attempting to work with local or regional governments. So after lots of protracted negotiations and discussions, we finally, late in the day, took a leap of faith for my community and agreed to join Metro Vancouver under the terms of the treaty, but only under certain conditions. We are not a municipal government and never will be. Our governance powers are quite different. We don't want to assimilate into local government. It's not a culturally appropriate institution. And instead, we insisted we would be the first First Nation member of Metro Vancouver, and that we would negotiate with Metro Vancouver on certain provisions on how we interface with them. And this was set out in the treaty and provincial settlement legislation, which we were involved with drafting to ensure that these structures respect and accommodate the unique nature of our jurisdiction. Indeed, from the removal of lands from the ALR to the fear of Tsawwassen autonomy, I found that most treaty opposition had been rooted in land use issues. And if not for the treaty and the land use plan we would create, would clearly not comply with the livable region strategy. But this is why, in our treaty, we insisted that we be given the opportunity by our effective day to submit a plan similar to an OCP to the region. We were worried that we would continue to lack control over land use planning by virtue of inclusion in the regional planning processes, which would require 100% approval from Metro municipalities to amend our land use plan, an unlikely prospect in my experience. We succeeded in having our treaty state that the land use plan we had in effect on our effective day would be deemed to be compatible with the strategy. This was another major accomplishment to allow us to move forward. The region did not have the ability to vote on our OCP, so this first plan was critical to Tsawwassen. It is a plan that would become the component of the Livable Region strategy and our opportunity to insert ourselves into the vibrant economy of the Lower Mainland. Needless to say, we're quite sensitive about not having others interfere with our land use planning decisions. It's a critical part of an act of self-governance, and we were not prepared to negotiate this with any other level of government. This is pretty fundamental to autonomy, and it is surprising how many feel it is appropriate that they have some sort of say on how we plan our lands. For generations, we've never had any say on how the region has been developed, and it was taken from us and used to build what are now large cities and sizable economies, bustling areas that have created revenue for everyone except for us. And we had been watching this from the sidelines of our traditional lands. So self-government means to us that we're finally able to make these decisions, our own decisions on our own terms. And all of this has enabled the development we're now seeing at Tsawwassen, industrial. These are some of the commercial projects. And as controversial as the Tsawwassen Mills Mall has been, it was the anchor project that allowed us to plan things at a proper scale and allow us to access the financing we needed, etc., to enable everything we needed from an infrastructure perspective. Residential development is also underway, and this is interesting as we have more and more non-Tsawwassen members joining our neighborhood. This will be interesting to see how we sort out our relationship going forward with our leaseholders. So some people like to look at the bottom line. All this development has enabled resources we require to help close the gaps we face as a community. Not only do we have sustainable revenue and employment opportunities, but we are now a major economic contributor to the region. We also need to look at things our community values, such as the revival of our culture and language. And Tsawwassen Mills showcases an unprecedented number of Tsawwassen artists. I think of it as a mini renaissance. We're having more people participating in wellness services. We're starting to build a new youth center. We've spent $100 million on infrastructure in our community. Think about that, $100 million. It's a big gap. Tomorrow, actually, is the 10-year anniversary of the effective day of our treaty. So presenting to you today has provided me some time to reflect on the past decade and what we've achieved. But I have to be honest and say that our participation in Metro Vancouver was a big leap of faith on our part, and it hasn't entirely met my expectations, because our presence in this entity does not translate to inclusion necessarily. Metro Vancouver, our membership in Metro Vancouver, we had expected to benefit from things such as water and sewer, and our participation in TransLink. And if you see the one headline up there, we haven't been able to figure out a regional solution to sewer in Tsawwassen, so we had to build our own sewage plant. And there are a number of reasons and excuses related to this, but at the end of the day, I don't think our plant is necessarily the best regional solution. And ultimately, I feel partially responsible because we ran out of time in treaty negotiations to address this. And I had actually thought we would be able to negotiate a solution with the region. But ultimately, it seems that some change has to come through political interventions such as legislation and treaties to happen. And if we rethink the region, this is something I want to challenge us all to think about. What does reconciliation look in this region? Is it local governments continuing to ignore First Nation jurisdiction? And obviously, I can't paint all municipalities with the same brush. Some cities like Vancouver have been working hard to reconcile Indigenous communities within its frameworks, which is incredibly exciting work. But finding some appropriate way for First Nations to engage with the region is an important discussion. First Nations can't just comply or fit in with structures we had no part of designing. So this is a challenge. We have to find a way to think about how we can engage in the region that includes a First Nation perspective. So here is our another photo of our sewer plant and our new playground adjacent to a sports field. And these are facilities I've dreamed about building when I was chief, but we never had the resources for. This region has always been made up of local communities from pre-contact to today. This is now what we must challenge ourselves to really think about. What will it take to think regionally and to break out of our silos? I've tried to be a bit provocative because I want to challenge us to really think about this territory, including its history and its future. And I no longer hold office, so I don't have to be as polite as I used to be on some of this stuff. As I said, tomorrow is our 10-year anniversary for our self-government journey. And while part of me is sad to no longer be leading my community, a larger part of me is thrilled by the transformation our community is facing. That is because the risk our people took into entering into a treaty with BC and Canada over 10 years ago. I can't wait to see what unfolds during the next 10 years and hope to see many other First Nations find their path to self-determination. So I would lastly say, never underestimate the power of vision, and thank you all for doing your part in learning about these issues. This poll was raised at UBC last year and is a strong symbol of hope for our collective future, and I think it's a good symbol for all of us to feel hope, I think anyways. So thanks for listening to me and my views of rethinking this region. Haichka, Haisapka.
Thank you very much, Kim, for that very insightful presentation. I think it's wonderful that we're gathered just before the 10th anniversary of that historic treaty. You've been an outstanding leader in this whole process of reconciliation within this region and continue to provide us with a very positive but blunt understanding of the issues that we faced and what we still have to deal with. So your characterization of this place as a region of local communities, to me, reflects what it was perhaps before contact and what it is now, and the strength of what it can be in the future. So I know you have to go. I won't prolong this, but I just hope you will all join me in thanking Kim for her presentation.
Thank you.